Tonight, a Trumpian G7 summit. Our president meets other world leaders who try to push him in the right direction when it comes to China, Iran, and more. That as Trump focuses on his pal Putin and bringing the next summit to his own golf course. Then Trump in 2020, a new primary challenger and some worrisome signs for the president, and a huge shocker in a poll among 2020 Democrats. We'll unpack both. And an NFL quarterback ends his career because of pain and injuries in the prime of it. So why are fans and even some football pros calling him a wimp or worse? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Well, life as an American with Donald Trump is, let's say, challenging, given that you never know what he's going to say or do. Even when he says or does something, then there's a pretty good chance that he'll change his mind or his comments within hours. Now, imagine if you think it's being tough as us living with him. Now think what it must be like for other world leaders to deal with him. Well, so it was this past weekend at the G7 summit with the leaders of the world's top economies. They work around Trump while trying to handle him in the public and take action without him, especially while he misses meetings like the one today on climate change. And while they try and overcome their divisions with the U.S., Trump, for his part, was celebrating what he called the thing called unity.
This is a truly successful G7. There was tremendous unity. There was great unity. We would have stayed for another hour. Nobody wanted to leave. We were accomplishing a lot, but I think more importantly, we were getting along very well. 7 countries, and it really was the G7.
Now, there was unity at the summit. The other 6 nations, they were unified in their belief that the U.S. needs to slow things down with this mounting trade and tariff war with China, which has already hammered the markets and threatens the world's economic stability. But Trump is the one who keeps putting the world on this particular roller coaster, even tweeting out last week as China threatened more tariffs in response to Trump's tariffs that American companies are, quote, hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China. That after another market sell-off on Friday. Trump, by the way, just for what it's worth, doesn't have the power to actually give said order. But the editorial board of all places, the Wall Street Journal, that's right, the same journal owned by one Rupert Murdoch, well, it hammered Trump for it anyway, writing, order, somebody should tell Chairman Trump this isn't the People's Republic of America. Also adding, Mr. Trump this week also dismissed the risk of a recession, but his continued mauling of Mr. Powell suggests he's less than confident about the U.S. economy. Perhaps Beijing is taking notice and believes it has leverage in the trade negotiations and is increasing. It closes the piece. What was that about the trade wars being easy to win? End quote. Now, part of the problem with Trump and China is no one really seems to know just how far Trump is willing to take this standoff, least of all Trump himself. He continues running hot and cold on taking the most serious actions against China. For example, compare that tweet to what Trump then said this weekend.
You have second thoughts about escalating the war?
I have second thoughts about everything.
Boy. Now, if China, Iran, and the climate weren't enough for the G7 leaders to deal with, they also had to put up with Trump pining for his bestie, Vladimir Putin, to be readmitted to the group. All of which may help explain what felt like a new approach to Trump at the G7 this past weekend. Flatter him in public, work around him in private, or as the Times titled their piece on it, Rule 1 at the G7 meetings, don't get you-know-who mad. For more, we turn to P.J. Crowley. P.J. is a former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs under President Obama, and he joins us now. He's also author of Red Line, American Foreign Policy in a Time of Fractured Politics and Failing States. Well, where to begin? Well, why not let's do a little bit of a fact check from somebody who knows this, P.J., probably better than anybody. The president contended today that the reason it's the G7 and not the G8 was because Obama got played by Putin, and as a consequence, it was pure jealousy and pettiness that's keeping Putin out. Apparently, that was a little bit of a newsflash to the other 6 nations there who are unanimous in saying that Russia doesn't belong there, given what happened with the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine, etc., as well as a whole host of other things the Russians have done, like in that election in 2016.
Absolutely, Richard. The president said that he got kicked out because of the Middle East. No, he got kicked out because of Ukraine. And notwithstanding his comments today that there were people in the room who said that Putin should come back in, I think it remains the unanimous view of the G7 that unless and until Vladimir Putin makes amends for the Russian incursion into Ukraine, he should stay outside the club. I mean, the president's right that in the abstract, is it better to have Putin in the room than not? Yes. Is it better to talk to him than not? Yes. But Putin has done nothing to justify the decision to bring him back in. And oh, by the way, in addition to Ukraine, in addition to supporting Assad, Vladimir Putin ordered the attack on the United States in 2015 and 2016, the attack during the election that obviously Donald Trump was a beneficiary of.
Oh, yeah, that thing. To that end, PJ, there are people who say, oh, well, this is just Trump being Trump. China hasn't always been the fairest of players here as it relates to on the trade front and currency, et cetera. Talk about, while there may be some merit to a president taking a new approach to China, there needs to be a coherent strategy in the idea of basically offending every ally we have and then wanting them to come on board with you in some united front when there's no rhyme or reason to it. This isn't some master three-dimensional chess plan. It seems like it's getting made up as we go along, and explain the consequences of that.
Well, in your opening comment, you failed to mention also that he designated himself as the chosen one, that who had to do this to take China to account, for its violation of economic principles, its theft of intellectual property rights, and so forth. Again, in the abstract, taking on China is actually a worthwhile thing to do. The problem is that Donald Trump is a one-hit wonder. It's tariffs, more tariffs, and the threat of tariffs. It was unclear as we went through the weekend in his discussions with world leaders whether he has, in fact, a strategy, whether he has, in fact, an end game, and whether even he has communicated effectively to Xi Jinping, hey, do these things, and in fact, there will be a deal. So all he's got is threats and bombast, and every indication now is that Xi believes that he has weathered the worst of this tariff war and may well be prepared to sit and wait Donald Trump out, knowing how the economy is going to be a central issue in the upcoming 2020 election.
You've been in a lot of closed-door meetings where two different nations or even two different parts of the world want two different things. In some ways, being transactional, I think, is great because it's clear. There's an agenda. You want something. You'll probably have to give something to get something, but there could be a deal that could be made. To me, I would think the lack of clarity or consistency makes it hard for anyone in the room to know really what he wants, where his line is, to steal a title from your book, where is his red line that he won't go beyond. The idea that he says today, China's reached out not once but twice to me, they really want to make a deal. He has no equity when it comes to truth that people can take him at face value. And I think you're right. If you're the Chinese, you believe it's when, not if, he's going to cave because he's only worried about next November. Talk about how these things really work and why the president at times can be his own worst enemy, especially if he's going to play the madman theory. It doesn't seem like he's willing to go through with it.
Well, Trump is his own worst enemy. He's got this Hamlet-like feature, and we saw it this weekend. Well, maybe I've got second thoughts. No, maybe I wasn't tough enough, on China. It is these very musings. I mean, go back to a year ago when we had the last G7 meeting and the president was on his way for his first meeting with Kim Jong-un. And here again, we were suffering from whiplash where the meeting's not on, the meeting's off. My policy's maximum pressure, but when he gets to Singapore, he says, well, I'm not going to talk about maximum pressure anymore, because look, we're getting along. The lack of discipline that the president has in both his verbal communications and his use of Twitter really does undermine the pressure that he thinks he's applying, whether you're talking about North Korea, you're talking about Iran, you're talking about China, or you're talking about Europe. I mean, the other aspect here is that putting pressure on China actually is a viable strategy. But remember, when the president came to office, one of the first things he did was to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which was intended to put economic pressure, on China indirectly by accentuating and deepening the economic relationship between the United States and many other countries in the world. The fact that we don't have TPP, we don't have allies when it comes, to the trade war with China, again, makes it much more difficult for the president ultimately to get what he wants.
And I know this took a backseat to so many of the other bizarre developments, but in a weekend reportedly where the president was considering, nuking a hurricane, he doesn't even show up to the climate, breakout portion of this as Brazil burns in front of our eyes. And if you listen to his comments on it, the literal ones are even worse than the interpretive ones in terms of, that, hey, it's not going to be good for my bottom line. Why would I do that? I mean, it is staggering sometimes if you just step back a few feet. This is the president of the United States, and he's the one in the back of the class shooting spitballs. It's crazy.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got to give President Emmanuel Macron credit. He's working very, very hard to keep this thing called the international community from completely falling apart. He's become the Trump whisperer. God bless him for that effort. But I think if you do step back, we see two things about this G7 summit. The first is that on the one hand, you've got a number of leaders who are distracted from their own, domestic political situations, whether you're talking about, Boris Johnson and the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. You're talking about a caretaker prime minister from Italy. Angela Merkel, who has been the leader of the free world, is on her way out. So Macron tried to put the best face on what was a G7 meeting without a lot of substance, without a lot of accomplishments. And then we have, the one piece of news from today, putting $20 million forward to try to help the fight fires in the Amazon. And it resulted from a meeting that the President of the United States did not attend. And this is the sad second reality, is that right now the United States has taken a leave of absence from its leadership position, and President Trump came to this important meeting and brought nothing to the table.
And maybe the worst indictment of all, I almost did a woo at the end of this where it felt like it could have been worse. He could have threatened to blow someone up. I mean, that's where we've gotten to this point, PJ, where it's like, okay, he's left foreign soil. He didn't start a war or do something here. Let's leave on a low note, but it could have been worse. But anyway, PJ, as always, my friend, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Richard.
All right, coming up next, the president loves to talk about just how good his and the nation's numbers are, except neither seems to be true as we speak. Are storm clouds gathering for the president's re-elect? We're going to get into that and more next.